made the Ben Shapiro and Eric Swalwell confrontation so revealing was not that it happened in the perfect place for either of them. It happened in the wrong place, which is exactly why it mattered. This was not a campaign debate. It was not a podcast. It was not one of those polished ideological showcase events where both sides arrived knowing exactly what the audience came to see. It happened inside a House Judiciary Committee hearing that was officially about alleged collusion in the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, a Republican-led effort to frame major advertisers and advocacy groups as part of a censorship system targeting conservative outlets. Ben Shapiro appeared there as a witness. The surface topic was media pressure, advertiser behavior, and the language of suppression. But Eric Swalwell understood something immediately. The cleanest way to turn that hearing on its head was not to get trapped inside the committee's preferred frame. It was to pull Shapiro out of the safe language of censorship and drop him into a much more uncomfortable public fight about what the right was actually preparing to do with power. That is how the hearing stopped feeling like a Republican message event and started feeling like a real confrontation. Because once Swalwell pivoted to Project 2025, the exchange became much bigger than one witness or one hearing title. It became a collision between two kinds of conservative rhetoric that often prefer not to be tested in the same moment. The first rhetoric says the right is being silenced, marginalized, blocked, punished for its ideas, shut out by elites, and then denied equal treatment in public discourse. The second rhetoric says that once power returns to conservative hands, the right intends to use that power aggressively on questions of immigration, abortion, social policy, state structure, and cultural conflict. Those two rhetorics can live side by side in movement politics for a long time. But the moment someone forces them into one conversation, the atmosphere changes. Suddenly, the question is not whether conservatives are being censored. The question becomes what exactly they want to do if they are no longer the aggrieved outsiders but the governing force. Swalwell understood that, and Shapiro understood almost immediately what Swalwell was trying to do. That is why the opening seconds of their exchange are so important. Swalwell starts from what sounds like a friendly baseline. He says Shapiro is one of the leading conservative voices in the country. He says the country has been Googling Project 2025. He says he is not trying to censor him. That setup matters because it removes the easiest escape route. Shapiro cannot claim, at least not immediately, that he is simply being silenced or denied a hearing. He is being invited to explain something. Then Swalwell asks a deceptively simple question. On a scale of 0 to 100, how much do you support Project 2025? That is a good question, not because it is technically precise, but because it is politically clarifying. It forces a witness to do one of three things: own it, distance from it, or dodge. Shapiro's answer was a dodge, but a very revealing dodge. He said, like Donald Trump, he had not looked all that deeply at Project 2025, and then he mocked Democrats by saying they were acting like Peter Pan and Tinker Bell, as if repeating Project 2025 enough would magically revive their presidential candidate. That answer does a lot of work at once. It distances him from the formal blueprint. It performs confidence for the audience. It reframes the concern as democratic panic rather than substantive policy scrutiny. And it tries to deny Swalwell the clean soundbite of ownership. But then something interesting happens. Swalwell does not waste time fighting over whether Shapiro has read the whole document. He simply says, fine, let's talk about pieces of it. That is the moment the exchange becomes dangerous for Shapiro in a different way, because broad disavowal is easy. Point-by-point confrontation is harder. Swalwell proceeds like a prosecutor who does not need the witness to sign the full manifesto. He only needs the witness to agree, one issue at a time, with enough of the worldview that the denial starts sounding hollow. Mass deportations, the abortion pill, same-sex marriage, Social Security, book restrictions. One by one, Swalwell turns a supposedly abstract conservative policy blueprint into a series of concrete value tests. And each time Shapiro answers, the center of gravity shifts a little further away from censorship grievance and a little closer to governing intention. That is what gives this hearing exchange its real dramatic force. It is not that Swalwell catches Shapiro in a legal contradiction. It is that he drags him into a public demonstration of alignment. When Shapiro says he supports the deportation of illegal immigrants who are not of benefit to the generalized American public, he is no longer floating above the document in amused detachment. He is inhabiting the policy terrain. When he says he is fully pro-life and not in favor of the distribution of the abortion pill, the hearing is no longer about ad cartels and media pressure. It is about what conservative power looks like when translated into policy consequences. When he says he favors traditional marriage between a man and a woman and distinguishes private arrangements from whether government should attach benefits to the relationship, he is no longer an injured media witness. He is a witness to a governing ideology. And that is the structural brilliance of Swalwell's line of questioning. He does not need to prove that Shapiro wrote Project 2025. He only needs to show that when asked about several of its most politically explosive elements, Shapiro keeps landing in the same neighborhood. The audience can do the rest. Now, to understand why this works so well, you have to understand what Ben Shapiro represents in the conservative ecosystem. He is not just another pundit. He is one of the most recognizable and rhetorically disciplined conservative communicators in the country. Someone whose audience expects speed, control, verbal precision, and above all, the aura of being harder to trap than his critics. That is a central part of his brand. He is supposed to be the person who sees the move coming, the person who dismantles the framing, the person who never really sits still long enough to be pinned down by a hostile questioner. So when someone like Swalwell forces him into a series of short answer ideological admissions, the moment feels larger than the content alone. It feels like a brand test. And Shapiro, to his credit or blame depending on the viewer, does not fully retreat. He answers. Sometimes he answers in ways that are evasive. Sometimes he answers in ways that are direct. Sometimes he reframes. Sometimes he jokes. At one point he says, "Congrats on becoming a Republican," when Swalwell describes wanting less bureaucracy and more efficiency. That line is classic Shapiro. Quick, audience-aware, meant to seize back control of the rhythm. But it does not actually dissolve the problem, because Swalwell is not trying to out-joke him. He is trying to use the hearing itself as a device to strip away the abstraction around conservative media complaint and expose the hard policy content living underneath it. The same thing happens when the exchange moves to sexuality and religion. Swalwell presses on same-sex marriage and then asks, "Is it a sin to be gay?" Shapiro tries to widen the answer, talking about sexual orientation, government regulation, consenting adults, and the distinction between private activity and public benefits. But Swalwell narrows again. Just you to me, is it a sin or not? Finally, Shapiro says that from a religious Jewish perspective, orientation is not a sin, but activity is. That answer instantly transforms the hearing, because at that point, the viewer is no longer watching a witness describe censorship against conservative media. What the viewer is watching a major conservative figure explain how his religious moral worldview intersects with the policy language surrounding marriage and sexuality. This matters because it reveals one of the central tensions inside American conservatism. Conservative media personalities often prefer to argue that their views are being excluded because elites hate dissent. Their critics often argue that the actual problem is not dissent, but the content of the agenda itself. What conservatives mean to do, regulate, reverse, restrict, or remove when they are in power. Swalwell's questioning is designed to force that tension into the open. Not to say you are forbidden from saying these things, but to say let the country hear clearly what these things are. And that is why the setting of the hearing becomes almost ironic. Republicans convened a hearing meant to dramatize collusion against conservative voices in media. But one of the most memorable moments was a Democrat using the platform to say, in essence, if you want the public to worry less about the right, then perhaps stop pretending that the most controversial parts of its governing ambitions are media inventions. This is also why the exchange moved so fast online. It had all the ingredients: recognizable figures, a hearing room, a witness who thrives on ideological combat, a Democratic lawmaker who understood clip culture well enough to turn 5 minutes into a sequence of escalating friction points. And beneath the viral layer, it had something more important: genuine symbolic value. Because the confrontation was not really Shapiro versus Swalwell in a narrow personal sense. It was conservative media legitimacy versus liberal prosecutorial framing, It was grievance politics versus policy exposure. It was the question of whether the right can continue to present itself mainly as the victim of cultural power while simultaneously preparing a very muscular program for governing power. That contradiction sits at the center of modern Republican media strategy. The right often wants to speak in two registers at once. Register 1 says, they are silencing us, demonizing us, excluding us, censoring us, blacklisting us. Register 2 says, once we return to power, we intend to restructure the state, remake institutions, remove protections, expand executive control, redirect federal power, and reorder major areas of public life. Both registers can be politically useful. The first builds solidarity through grievance. The second builds solidarity through mission. But the moment someone like Swalwell forces them into the same frame, the performance becomes harder to sustain cleanly. That is what makes this hearing exchange more than a viral spat. It is a miniature portrait of the political problem facing the American right in the Project 2025 era. How do you keep claiming you are merely trying to speak freely when your critics are talking not just about speech, but about the governing architecture your side is ready to build? And how do you keep that governing architecture vague enough to evade scrutiny while still satisfying the base that wants clarity, aggression, and reversal? Shapiro tried to solve that problem in real time by half distancing, half owning, after he said he had not looked deeply at the project. But once Swalwell itemized specific positions, Shapiro often sounded quite comfortable occupying them. That combination is politically understandable. It allows flexibility, but it also creates exactly the sort of exchange Swalwell was hoping for, where the viewer starts to think maybe the disagreement is not really about whether this agenda exists, but about how explicitly its advocates are willing to name it in hostile settings. There is another layer here that matters. Swalwell himself is not a neutral civic educator. He is a partisan, skilled at confrontation, fully aware of how hearings become content. He knows how to ask questions that are less about extracting policy white papers and more about shaping public memory. The hearing clip is the product. Mocks the line of questioning as the structure that makes the clip useful later. That does not make the exchange fake. It makes it modern. Congressional hearings are no longer only institutional oversight venues. They are content factories, identity theaters, and coalition signaling arenas all at once. Members perform not just for colleagues, but for donors, activists, journalists, enemy audiences, and future clips. Witnesses know it. Lawmakers know it. The public knows it, even if people still pretend otherwise. Swalwell's genius in this moment is that he does not fight that condition. He uses it. He knows the hearing title is not naturally in his favor, so he repurposes the stage. He turns the witness into a carrier of the very agenda Democrats want voters to fear. And he does so in a way that lets the witness's own answers do most of the work. That is why the exchange feels less like a shouting match and more like an inversion. The committee wanted a censorship narrative. Swalwell wanted a Project 2025 narrative. For a few minutes, he won. And once you see that, the rest of the exchange makes more sense. When Shapiro talks about restructuring Social Security and increasing the retirement age because Congress knows the program is going bankrupt and is lying about it, he is again doing something that is both rhetorically smart and politically risky. Smart because he sounds like the adult in the room, willing to say the uncomfortable truth. Risky because he is again stepping into the policy substance that Democrats want attached to the broader conservative governing project. When he rejects a ban on books about slavery, but distinguishes that from allowing schools to make decisions about what materials are appropriate for children, he is again trying to split the difference between broad public reassurance and more specific conservative cultural priorities. This is a familiar Shapiro move. He often seeks to sound simultaneously principled and pragmatic, absolutist in his critique of the left, yet careful enough on specifics to avoid being reduced to the most caricatured version of the right. The problem in the Swalwell exchange is that the cumulative effect matters more than any single answer. Each answer may be defensible on its own terms to his audience, but together they form a map, and Swalwell is not asking for a map by accident. Either he is trying to show that what Republicans and conservative media allies often dismiss as Democratic hysteria is in fact a set of real policy commitments, moral commitments, and governing instincts that become visible the minute a prominent conservative figure is asked directly. This is why the hearing clip traveled so efficiently. People on the left saw it as a moment when the mask slipped. People on the right saw it as a moment when Shapiro held his own in hostile territory and exposed Democrats' obsession with Project 2025. Both audiences got something they could use. That is the hallmark of a genuinely potent confrontation. It does not merely confirm one side's worldview, it sharpens both. But if you ask which side gained more structurally from the exchange, the answer depends on what you think the larger battle was. If the battle was over who looked sharper in the room, Shapiro probably did enough to satisfy his base. If the battle was over whether Democrats could tether a popular conservative communicator to the most controversial aspects of the broader right-wing agenda, Swalwell absolutely landed his point. And for long-form political storytelling, the second question matters more. Because what lasts is not just the wit or the tension, it is the meaning. The meaning of this exchange is that one of the country's most visible conservative commentators was dragged, in a setting designed to spotlight conservative victimhood, into a revealing set of answers about immigration, abortion, sexuality, and entitlement reform. That is not nothing. It says something about how fragile movement framing can become when the other side finds the right wedge issue, the right hearing, the right witness, and the right sequence of short questions. It also says something about the media age we live in. A formal hearing about ad market collusion and responsible media frameworks can become memorable not because of the technical testimony at its center, but because one lawmaker identifies the emotional argument hiding nearby and turns the entire room toward it. That is a different kind of political skill than legislative craftsmanship, but it is a real skill. Swalwell has it. Shapiro has it too, which is why the exchange never collapses into total domination by one side. This is important. The clip is not memorable because Shapiro appears speechless or broken. He does not. He argues, edge jokes, reframes, and answers. The clip is memorable because the hearing manages to produce a rare alignment between viral friction and substantive revelation. The audience sees a clash, but it also sees what the clash is about. That is the sweet spot of modern political media. Not empty combat, not technocratic density, but conflict that reveals the architecture underneath. And underneath this exchange sits a deeper American argument. Is the right primarily a censored minority trying to preserve basic freedoms? Or is it a movement preparing to use power in sweeping, transformative, and for many Americans, frightening ways? The answer, of course, may be both, depending on who is speaking and what the moment demands. But Swalwell's point was that conservatives cannot have the full emotional benefit of the first identity while expecting the public never to examine the second. That is why the exchange matters now, even outside its original hearing. Because Project 2025 was never only a document, it was a symbol, a shorthand for the question of whether the next conservative governing push would be incremental and managerial or openly revisionist, aggressive, and ideologically coordinated. By asking Shapiro whether he supported the project and then forcing him through its pieces, Swalwell was not simply quizzing a witness. He was turning Shapiro into a stand-in for a larger ecosystem. And Shapiro, by answering as he did, reminded everyone why he remains such a powerful figure inside that ecosystem. When he does not retreat from hard questions in the way more cautious Republicans often do. He advances, reframes, counterpunches, and tries to sound more coherent than the people accusing him. But there is a cost to that style in hostile settings. The more willing you are to answer, the more visible your worldview becomes. That is the paradox of confidence under interrogation, and that is why this clip survives. Because at the center of it is not just a fight between a congressman and a commentator. It is the old fight between exposure and performance. Swalwell's job is exposure. Shapiro's job is performance strong enough to withstand exposure. The audience gets to decide which one won. Yet even that framing is incomplete because there is one more thing happening here. The hearing also shows how the boundary between politics and media has effectively dissolved. Ben Shapiro is not an elected official, but he operates with political significance. Eric Swalwell is an elected official, but he operates with media instincts. The hearing is legislative in form, but digital in function. Its afterlife is not in committee markup. It is in clips, posts, reaction videos, ideological commentary, and the much larger struggle over which side can define what the country thinks it is actually voting for. That is why the confrontation deserves to be remembered. Not because it was the loudest hearing exchange of the year, not because one line destroyed the other side, not because either man changed his worldview on camera. It matters because it condensed one of the central political questions of the era into a few minutes of live exchange. Can conservative media figures continue to present themselves mainly as the targets of elite suppression? Or will they be forced, more and more often, to answer in clear terms for the agenda that accompanies their return to power? Swalwell tried to force that answer. Shapiro tried to keep it complicated. The tension between those two impulses is exactly what made the hearing worth watching. And that is why the confrontation lingers. Because it did what the best political clashes do. It made a larger structure visible. For a few minutes, the abstractions fell away. No committee title could hide the real fight. No joke could completely dissolve the stakes. A no-dodge ownership could erase the accumulation of aligned answers. The country was allowed to see in miniature what happens when grievance politics is made to sit still long enough for governing ideology to come into view. That is the real meaning of Ben Shapiro versus Eric Swalwell. Not commentator versus congressman, not left versus right in some generic sense, but one side trying to force the other to admit what its victory would actually look like, and the other side trying, with considerable skill, to keep that admission just ambiguous enough to remain politically useful. That is a very American kind of confrontation now, and it is only getting more common. There is another reason this exchange has more staying power than a normal viral hearing moment. It sits right on top of a broader transformation in how coalitions communicate with the public. For years, Republicans benefited from a kind of two-track messaging system. Institutional Republicans often use careful, legalistic, incremental language. The media ecosystem around them used much sharper language, much more moral certainty, much more appetite for reversal. The benefit of that arrangement was obvious. The party could sound responsible while the base could still feel fully energized. Project 2025 disrupted that comfortable separation because it gave critics a concrete document around which to organize their fears. Suddenly, Democrats did not have to argue only from vibes, tone, or inference. They could point to a blueprint, even if not every conservative wished to own every page of it. That made life more complicated for conservative communicators like Shapiro. Full ownership would invite backlash. Full disavowal would disappoint or confuse parts of the base. So the most sustainable posture became partial distance plus issue-by-issue agreement. That is exactly the posture Swalwell targeted. And he targeted it effectively because he understood the political vulnerability of modular agreement. Once a witness says, "I have not studied the whole thing, but yes on this piece, yes on that piece, yes on the next piece," the public hears something more than nuance. It hears pattern. Pattern is politically stronger than nuance. Pattern is what viewers remember. Pattern is what opponents package. That is why the hearing exchange feels like it exposes more than it technically proves. Why it does not prove that Shapiro is formally attached to the full document. It proves something more narratively useful to Democrats, that when pressed on several of its flashpoints, one of conservatism's most influential voices keeps landing inside the same ideological architecture. And hearing rooms are especially effective places for that kind of narrative proof because the format itself gives the exchange a certain civic seriousness. A podcast clash is easy to dismiss as content. A congressional hearing, even when it is absolutely content, still carries the visual weight of public accountability. Nameplates, microphones, flags, members on the dais, witness table. All of it makes even a familiar internet-style confrontation feel upgraded into a kind of national examination. Swalwell knew that. Shapiro knew that too, which is why neither man behaved as though the moment were trivial. The funniest part of the exchange, or the most unsettling depending on the viewer, is how quickly both men reveal the world they come from. Swalwell speaks in the rhythm of an opposition prosecutor who already knows the broader story he wants. Shapiro speaks in the rhythm of a commentator who knows every pause can be punished and every admission can be clipped. So every answer must carry both substance and defensive architecture. They are not just debating ideas, they are each managing future circulation. That is modern politics in one picture. Nobody speaks only to the room anymore. Everyone speaks to the edit. Everyone speaks to the upload. Everyone speaks to the faction that will decide hours later whether the clip means domination, humiliation, proof, evasion, hypocrisy, or fear. And still, despite all that self-consciousness, real meaning can emerge. That is what happened here. The exchange clarified that the conflict over Project 2025 was not merely a fight over branding. It was a fight over whether the public would be allowed to see continuity between conservative grievance media and conservative governing plans. Republicans and allied media often prefer to keep those worlds adjacent, but not fully fused in the public mind. Swalwell's questioning was an attempt to fuse them. In that sense, his best question was not any single-issue question. His best question was the first one, the percentage question, because it set up the whole trap. Once Shapiro refused full ownership, every later concession became more meaningful. If he had simply said, "I fully support it," the exchange would have flattened into routine ideological combat. If he had fully rejected it, the exchange would have become a fight over receipts. Instead, he chose the middle path. And the middle path is where prosecutors thrive. Because the middle path creates tension. It says, "I am not with them." Then it says, "But on mass deportation, yes. On abortion pill restrictions, yes. On traditional marriage, yes. On Social Security restructuring, yes." Not every answer is identical. Not every policy lane is equally strong. But the sequence builds its own logic. And in politics, sequence is often stronger than summary. Swalwell understands sequence. That is why he keeps moving. He does not stay long enough on any one answer for Shapiro to fully rebuild the abstract frame. He takes the answer, takes the concession, or takes the qualification, and moves to the next piece. That pace is what turns the exchange into a conveyor belt of exposure. Shapiro, for his part, tries to puncture that conveyor belt with humor and fluency. Sometimes he succeeds, but the larger structure is against him because the hearing no longer belongs to the committee's original subject. It belongs to the alternate subject Swalwell has installed in the room. That is real power. The power to redefine what a public event is about while everyone is still inside it. Congressional hearings used to be understood mainly as oversight exercises. They are now also narrative battlegrounds in which members compete to impose the governing interpretation of the day. Swalwell did that here with unusual efficiency, and it matters that he did it to Ben Shapiro. Had the witness been a lower-profile activist, the moment would not carry the same symbolic charge. Shapiro represents intellectualized conservative media. He represents the right's claim that its agenda can survive adversarial scrutiny. He represents a form of articulate combat that many conservatives trust more than they trust party officials. So when he is placed under pressure, and the pressure produces not collapse, but recognizable alignment with controversial right-wing priorities, the public effect is strong. The exchange stops being about a marginal figure and becomes a window into the broader logic of the coalition. That is why this script, this hearing, this clip, all matter beyond their original time slot. Because the confrontation asks a simple but destabilizing question. What happens when the people who say they only want fairness are asked, in specific terms, what kind of power they actually want? Sometimes they reveal more than they intended. Sometimes they reveal exactly what they intended, but the setting makes it newly visible. Either way, the audience learned something, and that is what happened here. The hearing was supposed to be about whether conservative media had been targeted unfairly by advertising alliances and institutional pressure. Instead, for one stretch of time, it became something else. A public demonstration that when a leading conservative communicator is pressed on the substance of the right's governing ambitions, the answers do not sound like mere complaints about censorship. They sound like a blueprint of their own. Sunra, that is why Ben Shapiro versus Eric Swalwell still matters. Because it was not just a clash, it was a conversion. A hearing about suppression converted into a hearing about intention. And once that conversion happened, the country got to hear a different argument than the one the room was originally built to deliver. Sometimes that is the most revealing thing politics can do.